How's it going, everyone? And welcome back to Real Northern Bass. We're bringing you Jig Fishing 102. We covered everything in 101 as far as jigs themselves, and in episode 102, we're going to cover rods, reels, and line. Getting straight into it, let's talk about rods first. There is no right or wrong answer when it comes to this. There are better answers than some, but really there's a whole range of what you could use for rods that are going to be acceptable for every kind of jig that I covered in Jig Fishing 101. There are definitely personal preferences for whatever kind of jig you're fishing, what kind of depths, how close you are to structure, what kind of structure you're fishing, etc. But again, there really is no right or wrong answer. There's definitely a better answer, but that doesn't mean it is the answer. Keep that in mind because there's going to be some of these lengths and powers and actions that I throw at you that are all acceptable. And there really is, again, no right or wrong answer. It comes down to your personal preference for the type of jig fishing that it is that you want to do. So bear that in mind as I go through this. With that all being said, I'm going to start with my absolute go-to because this rod to me is jack of all trades. This is the Douglas X-Matrix 715F. Now, Douglas has a numbering system for how they go through their models to cover both length, power, and action. Unlike some other companies out there where they specifically say what the power and action is through, letter abbreviations. MH-F, that's a medium heavy fast. In this case, a 715F is a 7-foot, 1-inch long rod. The 5 is for medium heavy, the F is for fast. So, 7-1, medium heavy fast. This is my favorite rod because I can do literally anything that I could ever want with any jig from anywhere from 1/4 of an ounce up to 3/4 of an ounce. And whether I'm pitching it really close to a dock inside of a foot of water that's 20 feet away from me, or if I'm dragging something like this where I've got the little micro citizen on there on a 1/2 ounce football jig that I've cast almost 200 feet away from the boat and I'm dragging it on the bottom in 60 feet of water. It does not matter. This rod can do it all. Now, is it ideal for every single one of those applications? No. I can probably find any one of 3 or 4 other different rods I own that it will be better suited for any one of those specific situations over the 715F. But that's why I like this rod. A rod like this, to me, it's universal. This one rod will do literally anything you could ever need to or dream of doing for jig fishing. Again, it covers all of your kind of super finessey, kind of twirl the wrist, flick it 20 feet cast so you can skip it underneath the dock that's only a foot over the water. Or I can go out there and fish for smallmouth and bomb out a heavy jig out into the middle of deep water and drag that thing for 150 feet and set the hook even at the end of a 200-foot cast down 60 feet and still get a good hook set on this. That's why I call it my jack of all trades. It will do all those things at least very well, if not exceptionally well. To elaborate more on why it's so special, to me, it's got the perfect mix of what I look for in a jig rod, especially something that I want to be universal for everything I could throw it with. It's got just enough backbone inside of this that if I'm going open water, I'm throwing a jig really far, I'm going into deep water, I've got enough backbone in there that I can set the hook even with just straight fluorocarbon and pin those fish. I get a good solid hook set on the first swing and I can keep that fish pinned all the way back to the boat. If I'm asking it to do the absolute extreme of what it is that I'm looking for, it can do that. But then there will be days where, let's say, specific example in the middle of the summer, I can go to certain lakes all over the greater Northeast and I can catch smallmouth out deep off the bottom, or I can move back in shallow and pitch a jig up against docks and catch largemouth out of grass in a foot of water. I can do all that with this one rod. So when I get out of that deep water, talked about example, what about shallow water? There's just enough finesse in the action on this rod, being that it's a fast, not an extra fast, just a fast. So from rod tip down on an extra fast, it might break this far from the tip where there's a lot of flexibility from, in that first 6 inches. And then a fast, that kind of hard breaking point, maybe 8 or 10 inches. So that's the difference what we're talking about when we're getting into the action side of things. And having that 715 fast, it's a little shorter so I can really kind of maneuver around my boat and around my surroundings. And having that fast action on the rod allows me to kind of like wrist flick whip it and get it to skip underneath docks. So I can pitch it into a little pocket inside of a bunch of tree branches. I can put it just up beside a log that's, you know, buried underneath a couple of branches overhanging a few feet up. Regardless of whatever it is, even when I'm in those close quarters, when I'm trying to be extremely precise, this rod has just enough suppleness to it that I don't have those errant casts that you would get with something that's a lot stiffer, that has an extra fast action, that doesn't have a lot of finesse to it. So I can kind of really build up the momentum and slingshot those jigs into that cover that I'm trying to get to. That is why I like the 715F from Douglas. On the X Matrix specifically, they have 3 different rod lineups. This, with the X Matrix, it's their higher end rod. It's a little bit more stiffer than, say, the LRS, which is the next step down. Higher sensitivity on it too, so when I'm trying to feel those light bites, I'm going to have a better chance of doing that on this rod than I would, say, like the LRS or maybe some other, not necessarily low end, but, you know, even half the cost of this rods. That's what I like about that rod. It is just one of many examples. Something else along the lines of this, really from like a 7-foot to a 7'2" medium heavy fast rod, will do all those same things for you. Depending upon what model it is, what brand, what price point you're shopping at, how much power exactly you get in that, you know, how much of the rod has like true backbone, and then where that action breaks at the tip for your fast action is going to vary from rod manufacturer to rod manufacturer, from, you know, what level you are buying these rods at cost-wise, the materials you're using, etc. There's a lot of things that go into that, but for me, if I'm looking for a jack-of-all-trades rod that works for any and all kind of jigs, deep open water to 10 feet off structure, pitching into a foot of water, 7 foot to a 7'2" medium heavy fast, to me, will do everything you could possibly want. So that's a good starting point, just one shining example of everything you possibly want out of a jig rod. Now, going from that rod that's kind of a jack of all trades, can do everything, now we get into something that's a little bit more specialty, in the sense that, well, what if you're more of just a truly open water angler and you want to throw either things like just a swim jig, right? Or a regular football jig that you're going to throw out into the middle of open water and you're going to fish a ton of submerged rocks or submerged points or just offshore grass. Anything of that nature where you know you're working in not a foot of water, but maybe we'll say 8 feet of water or deeper, and you're doing a lot of this fishing far away from the boat. That's when I'm going to pick up a much longer rod. One of my other go-to rods is the 765 XF from Douglas. This is another phenomenal rod. It's a 7.6 medium heavy extra fast. With that longer length, I have a lot more leverage on the fish. So even if I'm not necessarily going for really long casts, but say I'm doing moderate distance casts, 30 plus feet into thicker grass, or I'm doing 30 to 150 feet out into, say, 20 to 25 feet of water and I'm fishing offshore rock piles or offshore submerged grass, where I'm not necessarily concerned with trying to be very finessey and extremely accurate in my approach. I'm fishing a lot of very open areas. I just need to land in the general area of what it is that I'm trying to target. That's where I like having the extra rod. I have a lot more line take up just in the rod alone. I have a lot more power and backbone and leverage that I can use to my advantage against these fish when I'm throwing it, again, around vegetation or down in deeper rock piles where I'm fishing, I'm setting the hook both far and deep from my standing point on the boat. I like to have that longer rod for all those applications. I know some guys that will go to a 7.8 rod or a 7.4. Really, 7.4 to 7.8 is what they would consider to be their open water jig rod. And it's not just your bottom contact jigs, whether it be something like the Little Magnet for Beast Coast that's perfect for grass, or just a swim jig, a football jig, an arky head, you know, anything that is truly kind of open water or like heavy duty structure. You can use this for a whole variety of different jigs. But if I know that I'm just truly going out there and bombing a moving jig like that, and I'm trying to cover a ton of water as fast as I can, then this would be great for that, because I can sling it really far from the boat. If I hook up on the very end of my cast, I've got a lot more mechanical advantage to my advantage to really get a solid hook set on this fish and drive that hook point home and keep them pinned the whole way back. Then from there, you know, if you want to talk a little bit more close quarters, it's not bad. You can take this and you can go flip and pitch in some grass. And you've got, again, more length, more mechanical advantage to hook into these fish and haul them up and out. But something a little bit more finesse than, say, what I would consider to be like a true flipping stick, which would be like a lot more backbone. That would be something necessary if you're fishing some really, really thick matted vegetation. Not necessarily something you run up to in the northern half of the States. You might just be fishing something like pond cabbage or milfoil. While that can get thick, it's not thick like true grass mats. So you don't need a really stiff broomstick, but you might want something that's got a little bit more oomph and mechanical advantage than, say, a 7 to 7 foot 2-inch rod. That's where something like a 7.6 rod can come in handy. Because it's still a medium heavy and that longer rod, I want the extra fast. And the only reason is I am taking the same power in the rod, that medium heavy, and dispersing it over a longer taper. So I want the extra fast on that rod tip to come up a little bit quicker to provide me, it's not necessarily more power, but it's kind of like having more power, just to pick up that line, pick up that slack, and get that hook point, the tension to it, as quickly as I possibly can. That's where I like having something like this come in hand. So between these two, anything in that range, you got your 7 to 7.2 medium heavy fast, and you got like a 7.4 to 7.8 medium heavy extra fast, or even a heavy fast or heavy extra fast. If you want a little bit more, any of those will work. Again, there's no right or wrong answer on this. It all depends on the specific application that you're trying to go for. But if you want two rods that can kind of handle literally anything and everything you can think of for every single jig type that I covered in Jig Fishing 101, get yourself a 7 to a 7.2 and then a 7.4 to a 7.8. You've got all your short range, your long range, really heavy cover, really thin open water, doesn't matter. Both those rods will cover absolutely everything. Last but not least on the rods, I covered two different casting models, but I gotta give some love to the spinning rods. And yes, I do use a spinning rod a lot for jig fishing, especially when I'm smallmouth fishing and I'm throwing really light jigs. Casting rods, I can throw a 1/4 ounce jig on that 715F, but it's not really ideal for it. That rod is still just a smidgen too stiff that I feel comfortable throwing a jig that light. If I'm going 1/4 ounce or lighter, that's where the spinning rod comes out. This is another one. There's really no right or wrong answer on this. My preference is the 724XF from Douglas, and again, X-Matrix, because when I'm throwing jigs on a spinning rod, I am typically doing this around bottom composition, like hard bottom composition. I'm trying to fish very specifically around deeper rock piles. I'm trying to drag across sand flats. I'm more often than not specifically going for smallmouth. I want to feel as much as I can. So I want a very high-end rod that I can throw a very light line so I can get it down there and present as subtle and finesse a presentation as I possibly can to these fish. And then I need something that I can easily take up a lot of that slack on, but then spinning rod, so I can use the drag on a spinning reel, which is much more friendly when it comes to fighting heavier fish on lighter line. Then this whole combination comes very in handy when I'm throwing the really light stuff. I will throw a 1/2 ounce jig on a spinning rod when it's really, really windy and I know that I'm trying to get around rocks and I can't really feel things as well. I personally prefer to throw braid to a fluorocarbon leader on a spinning setup much more than I do on a casting setup. So if I'm in those kind of conditions where I really need to feel the bottom, and then more importantly, I need to really feel the bite and the wind's blowing like 40 out there, that's where I like picking up a spinning rod. But when I'm not fighting it and I'm just trying to throw things that are really light, it's really, really hard to beat just a really good spinning setup for throwing a 1/4 ounce or even a 1/8 ounce jig. Sometimes they need it slow. Sometimes they need a really small presentation. So for me, I like to be prepared for those days when the fish are telling me, yeah, 2 days ago, I was happy to eat that traditional looking 1/2 ounce football jig with a big old craw trailer in the back. It's not gonna cut it today. But I know that they're still kind of keyed in those same feeding patterns, so I just got to downsize to give them a similar but just different enough presentation. That's where I like having the spinning rod. Throwing those lighter setups, it's very, very hard to beat. Now that we covered everything for rods, we're going to talk about reels. Sticking with the spinning setup, just because I already had it in my hand, I have a bunch of different reels that I really like. I love everything that Lew's Fishing has to offer. My absolute favorite spinning reel is the Custom Light in a 300 size series. There's something about the balance of this, the weight, and then especially that spool size when I'm dealing with lighter line. A 300 is kind of the best bang for my buck, where the spool is just big enough that the line comes off it very easily, but it's not heavy and creates as much imbalance as a 400 size series reel would. And to me, Custom Light is just top notch when it comes to the drag on this. It is as smooth as you could possibly hope for. Now, when you're dealing with more traditional jigs, I'm gonna go with a heavier braid and heavier fluorocarbon, so I don't need to worry about the drag as much. But when I'm throwing something really light, like a 1/4 ounce open water sniper from Beast Coast Fishing, or I'm throwing a hair jig, or in some cases, if I'm throwing a really small wobble head, or just dragging a naked 1/4 ounce football jig with a swim bait on the back, doesn't matter. Any of those applications, I'm typically gonna go with a lighter leader on that. So I need to back my drag down. And again, I still firmly believe that a spinning reel is the best way to go for having the best drag control when working with lighter line. That's where I really like the Custom Light. The Lewis Hypermag is still another phenomenal reel. That is my second favorite reel. I have 3 of these Custom Lights. I have 2 of the Hypermags. And then more on that kind of budget-friendly side, they have the Mach 2, which is yet another phenomenal spinning reel that's under that $100 mark. You kind of can't go wrong with spinning reels. Even the lower tier, lower price point spinning reels are still very good. And to get into an exceptionally phenomenal spinning reel, you don't have to break the bank like you would on a casting reel. So to go from pretty good to phenomenal is only a difference of maybe about $100 in this case in a lot of spinning reels. Versus a casting reel might be like $200 to $300. So Lewis Custom Light, they're all the same gear ratio. Anything about a 6.5 to 1 ratio is all I work with. If I can get a fast gear ratio on this, I absolutely would. But when it comes to dragging jigs, light jigs on a spinning setup, this Lewis Custom Light is phenomenal. I couldn't ask for anything more out of it. Hypermag, another one, again, Mach 2, they're all phenomenal. Now, when it comes to bait casting reels, I'm a little bit all over the place with what my preference is, but the one thing that's most consistent when it comes to bottom contact fishing with jigs, I want the highest gear ratio that I can possibly get because I want to take up slack on my line as fast as I possibly can. In this case, this is the Custom Pro from Lewis. It's an 8.3 to 1. I also have several of their Hypermags, which are 8.3 to 1 ratios. I have the Elite TI, which is another 8.2 to 1, I believe. I have the Custom Pro, I have the Custom Light. All of these are 8 something to 1 ratios. They're all in the 8s because again, when I'm bottom contact fishing, all of the action that I'm doing on a jig is in the rod. I'm doing nothing with the reel other than reeling in slack and then reeling in a fish after I get one. I'm not doing anything else with the reel. So for me, all the action is being imparted by the rod. The reel's only job is to pick up slack fast so I can set the hook as quickly as I can, which is exactly why I stick with a high speed ratio. If I were doing more of a constant movement jig, like I had talked about swim jigs in the Jig Fishing 101, I'm gonna back that down to a 6.3 or a 6.5 to 1 gear ratio because it's easier to speed up on that than it is to slow down. So I can work with more what the fish are in tuned for their cadence preference than if, say, I were working an 8.3 to 1 and they weren't really interested in getting anything that fast and I had to try and slow it down. It's a lot harder to maintain a much slower pace with a high speed gear ratio than it is to speed up with a lower speed gear ratio. Food for thought. Really, any of these are going to serve you extremely well, especially for your bottom contact. Anything high speed gear ratio, 8.2 to 1 or higher, you can't go wrong. So we covered the rods, we covered the reels. Last but not least is the line. Again, this is one of those things where a lot of this comes down to personal preference. I myself personally prefer to stick with strictly straight fluorocarbon for almost every single one of my jig applications just because I'm much more comfortable with it. I understand there is more benefit to going braid to leader on that, even on a casting setup, because that braid provides zero stretch or near zero stretch, so better sensitivity, so you're more likely to not miss really subtle, gentle bites. It's all about personal preference for what works best for you for how you like to work around everything else. With that said, I do have 2 rods set up that are braid to fluorocarbon leader, but almost every other jig rod that I own is straight fluorocarbon. I go with the Defiant heavy cover fishing fluorocarbon because it has exceptional abrasion resistance. Fluorocarbon is the king for abrasion resistance properties. It does not get any better than this. The Defiant heavy cover is a much more stout line than your average fluorocarbon. This 15.5 pound is my go-to, and I have it rigged up on 6 rods because of how good it is for versatility in every application that I throw it at. Especially fishing up here in the greater Northeast, where I spend a lot of my time traveling, I go up to places all over Vermont and in New York where there are a lot of zebra mussels that are present. In those places, they tend to have a lot of shale and like ledge. So the rock structure I'm fishing around tends to be a lot more abrasive, more sharp corners. Then you get in New Hampshire, we are called the Granite State for a good reason. We have a lot of granite rock everywhere, more granite ledge. So even that is really difficult to work around. That's why having fluorocarbon is so important when you're fishing jigs, especially in a bottom contact position. I like the 15.5 pound. It might be overkill in a lot of applications. I've used the 14 pound. In some cases, I've used the 11.6 pound or 12 pound from other brands. All of these are good. If you want a one-stop shop, I really prefer the 15.5 pound because it has worked for me in every application I can think of, whether I'm throwing it in 60 feet of water or I'm throwing it in 6 inches of water. Doesn't matter. This is held up to everything I've thrown at it, including zebra mussels. This has absolutely proven itself on Lake Champlain, which has everything between that really gnarly, jagged ledge and a ton of zebra mussels everywhere. I very, very rarely lose a fish when I'm up there dragging a jig on the bottom. Really, the only time I do is because I forgot to retie after a couple of fish. But you maintain retying it, you're constantly checking your line. I can drag this across rock and zebra mussels and still get those fish in every time. Still gonna retie it, no different than any other line out there, but it holds up through all that. That's why I like the 15.5 pound. If you wanna go braid to leader, then Defiance smooth casting braid is also phenomenal. When going with a braid to fluorocarbon leader, you need to really find a good leader knot that works best for you. Through all my research and all my reading and talking with friends and just getting that general feedback, the FG knot is the king of all. However, not very friendly to tie in general, let alone when you're trying to do it in really high winds or really rough chop. I personally prefer the Alberto knot because it is nearly just as good as far as really low profile when tied correctly. And regardless of what the conditions are outside, I can tie it very easily for myself and consistently. I don't have to think about it. It's not an overly difficult leader knot. My thing I like about it again is that when tied correctly, it's really thin. So especially in this case, in a casting setup, if you're going from braid to fluoro, unless you're tying it really short, you're gonna have that knot blow right by your thumb more often than not. So you want a really thin, low profile knot. That's where I like the Alberto or the FG even, because again, they're really low profile knots. But you go with braid, then what you get is that near zero stretch action out of that line. Because there's nearly zero stretch, you get instant feedback. You get higher sensitivity from what's going on the bottom. So you get better bottom composition feedback as to what you're dragging over, from rock to sand to pebbles to hard rock to shells. With a tungsten football jig or a tungsten jig in general, braid to a fluoro leader, you can feel all of those things. And then when you're getting inside a really thick grass, it's just kind of hard to beat really thick, heavy braid because it just kind of cuts through all that stuff. And you can horse those fish up and out of that thicker vegetation. And that works if you're just going straight braid too. It all comes down to personal preference. That's what I like about this topic. Again, first thing I said, I'm gonna reiterate one more time. There is no right or wrong answer on any of this when it comes to what rod length, action, and power you should have, what reel size and gear ratio you should have, what type of line and what line weight you should have. It all comes down to personal preference and application specific. What I did was my best to try and educate you on the pros and cons of everything, and then personal experiences to why I think it's really good in these specific situations, or why I think the 15.5 pound heavy cover is just so good for any application you can think of. I tried to bring it to you in a manner that is universal, so if you're trying to keep it very budget friendly, one simple setup, you can get that done. But if you want to expand on that and go 10 different jig setups, you're covered on all those things as well. So I hope you found this very enjoyable and helpful more than anything. I greatly appreciate everybody that watched this to the end. This is part 2 of part 4, so next up will be Jig Series 103. I will link that down in the comments once that's gone live. For everybody that is watching, if you haven't done so yet, please subscribe. I would greatly appreciate it. Also, leave a like, leave a comment if you have any questions, if you just had any thoughts you wanted to share on this, or, let me know how I did with it, if I did help you in any way, shape, or form. If there's anything else you want to see specifically broken down in greater detail, I can do that. Last but not least, every Wednesday night at 8 p.m., we do a live stream on that channel, youtube.com/@RealNorthernBass. You're here. It's easy enough to find me. 8 p.m. every Wednesday night. We talk about a variety of topics. We've covered a lot of this in greater detail. We can answer direct questions much more directly with people in the live stream. If you're interested, please, I encourage you to come check out the live streams. Other than that, thank you for watching. I greatly appreciate it. Catch you in the next one.